Welcome to Touching Animal Stories. The first time Molly saw the man in the white coat, she hid under the bed, her small body pressed against the cool wooden floorboards, her heart pounding like a tiny drum against her ribs. She didn't understand the words early stage dementia or progressive cognitive decline, but she understood the fear in her human's voice. The woman who had fed her, held her, and whispered secrets into her fur for the past 7 years. She understood the way Anne's hands trembled when she tried to pour milk into Molly's bowl, how they would shake so violently that the white liquid would spill over the sides, creating little puddles on the counter that Anne would stare at with a confused expression, as if she couldn't remember how they got there. She understood the way Anne would sometimes stare at her, with recognition flickering in her eyes like a dying light bulb, only to have that light go out completely moments later, replaced by a blankness that made Molly's fur stand on end. Molly was a small calico cat with patches of orange, black, and white that looked like a painter's careless spill, a chaotic masterpiece of color that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the light. She had been astray when Anne found her, shivering behind a dumpster on a cold November night, her tiny body curled into a tight ball to conserve what little warmth remained. Anne had wrapped her in her scarf, a soft woolen thing that smelled of lavender and old books, and carried her home, murmuring, "You're safe now, little one." Her voice gentle and warm like a blanket on a cold night. 7 years later, Molly was returning the favor, though she didn't know it had a name. Loyalty, devotion, love. All she knew was that when Anne needed her, she was there. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the slow creep of winter into autumn. Anne would leave the stove on after making tea, the kettle whistling its shrill song long after the water had boiled away, leaving behind only a scorched metal shell and the acrid smell of burnt plastic. She'd forget to lock the front door, leaving it slightly ajar so that on windy days it would creak open and close throughout the night, the sound like a ghost wandering the halls. She'd call Molly by the name of a childhood pet long gone, a dog named Whiskers, which made no sense at all. But Molly would answer anyway, rubbing against Anne's legs, purring loudly as if to say, "I'm here, I've got you. It doesn't matter what you call me." One Tuesday morning, Anne woke up and didn't recognize her own kitchen. She stood in the center of the room, hands trembling, eyes wide with panic, her breathing coming in short, shallow gasps. She turned in circles, looking at the familiar objects: the coffee maker, the refrigerator covered in magnets from vacations long past, the clock that always ran 5 minutes fast, as if they were foreign artifacts in a museum she'd stumbled into by mistake. Molly watched from her favorite sunbeam on the floor, her green eyes following Anne's every movement, her small body tense with concern. When Anne reached for a cabinet and pulled out a coffee mug, only to stare at it with utter confusion, as if she'd never seen such a thing before, Molly jumped onto the counter and nudged Anne's hand with her head, the gentle pressure of her small body a silent question. "Do you remember me?" Anne looked down at Molly, her brow furrowed in concentration as if trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Then slowly recognition flickered in her eyes. She reached down and stroked Molly's fur, the familiar motion calming her somewhat, though her hand still trembled against Molly's soft coat. "There you are, sweet girl," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I was looking for you." But it was getting worse. Molly learned to watch for the signs, to read the subtle changes in Anne's behavior like a seasoned detective. When Anne started repeating the same story 3 times in one conversation, her eyes growing distant as she relived memories that seemed to slip through her fingers like sand, Molly would jump into her lap and demand attention, pressing her paws against Anne's chest until Anne focused on her instead of the ghosts of the past. When Anne forgot to eat, wandering from room to room with a look of vague hunger on her face but no idea what to do about it, Molly would sit by the empty food bowl and meow until Anne remembered to feed them both, the sound pulling her back to reality like a lifeline. When Anne cried in the middle of the night, unable to remember where she was or how she got there, Molly would curl up beside her and purr until the sobs turned to sleep, her small body a warm, steady presence in the darkness. Then came the day Anne disappeared. Molly had been napping in a sunbeam on the living room floor, the warm light soaking into her fur, when she heard the front door click open and shut. She bolted upright, her ears twitching, her heart suddenly racing. Anne never went out without telling Molly first. She always said, "I'm just running to the store, sweet girl." Or, "Be back soon, kitty." Her voice warm and reassuring. This silence was wrong, unnatural. Molly darted to the window in time to see Anne walking down the street, her cardigan flapping in the breeze, her steps uncertain, as if she wasn't sure where she was going or why. She stopped occasionally to look around, her head turning from side to side, her eyes wide with confusion. Molly pressed her paws against the glass, meowing frantically, but Anne didn't look back. Without hesitation, Molly squeezed through the cat flap and followed, her small body moving with a determination that belied her size. Anne wandered for hours, turning down streets she didn't recognize, stopping to stare at houses as if trying to remember which one was hers. She asked a neighbor for directions but forgot them before she'd taken 3 steps. She sat on a park bench for a while, watching children play, her face filled with a sadness that made Molly's heart ache. Molly stayed close, always within sight, darting behind bushes when Anne turned around, afraid that if Anne saw her, she might try to shoo her home. Molly knew she couldn't let Anne out of her sight, not for a second. As the afternoon turned to evening, the temperature dropped and a chill wind began to blow. Anne began to shiver, her confusion turning to fear. She stopped a passerby and asked, "Where is 47 Oak Street?" The woman gave her directions, but Anne forgot them before she'd taken 3 steps. Molly watched from behind a parked car, her heart pounding in her tiny chest. She couldn't speak. She couldn't lead Anne home. All she could do was follow, hoping Anne would somehow find her way back. Then Anne stepped into the street without looking. Molly didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk or consider the consequences. She simply acted, darting forward and sinking her teeth into the hem of Anne's cardigan, yanking backward with all her strength. It was a desperate move, one that could have resulted in Anne stumbling and falling, but somehow it worked. Anne stumbled back onto the sidewalk just as a car sped past, horn blaring, the driver shouting obscenities out the window. Anne looked down at Molly, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, recognition flickered in them, brighter and clearer than it had in months. "Molly?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "My sweet girl?" Molly rubbed against Anne's legs, purring loudly, nudging her toward home. This time Anne followed, her hand reaching down to stroke Molly's fur as they walked, the familiar motion grounding her in the present. Someone. The next few months were a blur of doctor's appointments and difficult conversations, the kind that left Molly hiding under the bed, her ears flattened against her skull, her body tense with anxiety. Anne's daughter, Sarah, came to visit more often, her eyes red from crying, her voice tight with worry. Molly watched from the windowsill as Sarah and Anne argued about moving to an assisted living facility, their voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. "You can't stay here alone, Mom," Sarah pleaded, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "What if you forget to turn off the stove again? What if you wander off and don't come back?" "I have Molly," Anne said stubbornly, her voice quiet but firm, her hand reaching down to stroke Molly's fur. "She takes care of me." Sarah looked at Molly, who stared back with unblinking green eyes, her tail lashing slowly from side to side. "A cat can't take care of you, Mom," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "She can't call 911 if something happens. She can't make sure you take your medication." Molly hissed softly, her fur standing on end, her claws extending slightly as she prepared to defend her territory, her home, her human. How dare this woman question her ability to protect Anne? The day they came to take Anne away, Molly hid. She couldn't bear to watch Anne pack her bags, couldn't bear to see the confusion in her eyes as she tried to remember which clothes were hers, which photographs to take, which books would fit in the small suitcase Sarah had brought. When the moving van arrived, Molly slipped out the back door and waited in the garden until it was gone, her small body trembling with fear and grief. Sarah returned later with a carrier. "I'm sorry, Molly," she said, tears streaming down her face as she knelt on the floor, her hand reaching out toward Molly. "I can't take care of you and Mom at the same time. My apartment doesn't allow pets. Mrs. Henderson next door has agreed to take you." Molly backed away, her fur standing on end, her tail puffed out like a bottle brush. She hissed and growled, her small body tense with defiance. When Sarah tried to put her in the carrier, Molly fought with everything she had, scratching and biting until Sarah finally gave up and left her behind, her sobs echoing through the empty house. That night, Molly crept back into the empty house. Everything smelled like Anne, her perfume, her shampoo, the lavender soap she always used. But the house itself felt hollow, as if the soul had been ripped out of it. Molly slept in Anne's bed, curling up in the indentation her body had left in the mattress, the sheets still holding traces of her scent. She pressed her small body into the pillow, breathing in deeply, trying to hold onto the memory of her human. The next morning, Molly set out for the assisted living facility. She didn't know the address, but she remembered the route Anne had taken when she got lost. She followed the same streets, darting between bushes and underparked cars to avoid being seen, her small body moving with a determination that surprised even her. She crossed busy intersections when no one was looking, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes scanning the surroundings for familiar landmarks. It took her 3 days to find the place, a large building with a sign that read, Maplewood Senior Living. Molly waited outside the front door, watching as residents came and went, her green eyes following each person who exited the building, hoping to spot Anne. When she saw Anne being wheeled out into the garden by a nurse, she darted across the lawn, her heart racing with hope and fear. Anne's face lit up the moment she saw Molly. "Molly!" she cried, her voice filled with pure joy, reaching down to pet her. "You found me," Molly purred and rubbed against Anne's legs, her small body vibrating with relief, but a nurse shooed her away. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but pets aren't allowed on the premises," the nurse said, her voice firm but kind. As Molly was chased off the property, she heard Anne begin to cry. "Please," Anne begged, her voice breaking. "Let me keep her. She's all I have left." For the next 6 months, Molly made the journey to Maplewood every day. She learned the schedule, when Anne had breakfast, when she took her afternoon walk in the garden. Molly would wait under the same bench, emerging only when Anne was alone, her green eyes fixed on her human, her small body tense with anticipation. At first, the staff tried to shoo her away, waving their hands and making shooing noises. Then they started leaving food and water outside for her, small bowls of water and bits of tuna placed discreetly near the bench where Anne sat. Finally, one of the nurses, a kind woman named Maria, took pity on her. "Your cat visits every day, Mrs. Calloway," Maria told Anne one afternoon as she helped her into a chair in the garden. "She's been waiting under your bench for hours. Sometimes she sits there all day watching you." Anne's eyes widened with recognition and joy. "Molly's here?" Maria nodded, her eyes soft with compassion. "She won't come inside, but she's always there. Rain or shine, she's waiting for you." That night, Maria went to the administrator. "We have to make an exception for this cat," she insisted, her voice firm but respectful. "You've seen how Anne responds to her. It's the only time she's fully present. When Molly is with her, she remembers things she hasn't recalled in years. She eats better, sleeps better. It's like the cat brings her back to us." After much discussion, they agreed to let Molly visit, but only under supervision and only for 1 hour a day. The administrator was reluctant, citing health codes and liability concerns, but Maria was persistent. "This isn't just a pet," she argued. "This is therapy, this is medicine, and sometimes medicine comes with fur and 4 legs." The first time Molly was allowed inside, Anne wept as she held her, her tears falling onto Molly's fur like warm rain. "You came back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You never left me." Molly purred and nuzzled Anne's cheek, her small body pressed tightly against her human's chest, as if to say, "I told you I'd always be here." She could feel Anne's heart beating against her fur, steady and strong, and for the first time in months, Molly felt safe. Over the next year, something remarkable happened. Anne's decline slowed, almost imperceptibly at first, but the staff at Maplewood noticed it immediately. while other residents with similar diagnoses continued to lose their memories, becoming more withdrawn and confused with each passing month. Anne began to recognize faces again. She remembered stories from her past, recounting them with a clarity that surprised everyone who knew her. She started eating regularly and sleeping through the night, her days filled with a calmness that had been absent for years. The doctors were baffled. They ran tests, adjusted medications, but nothing explained the improvement. The nurses called it a miracle, whispering about it in the break room when they thought no one could hear. But Maria knew the truth. "It's the cat," she told the administrator one day, her voice filled with conviction. "Look at them together. When Anne is with Molly, she's present. She's herself. The cat reminds her who she is." One afternoon, as Anne sat in the garden with Molly curled in her lap, Sarah visited. She had been distant since the move, overwhelmed with guilt and grief, but something about seeing her mother with Molly changed her. She watched as Anne stroked Molly's fur and told her about her day, just as she had when Anne was still living at home, her voice filled with the same warmth and affection she'd always used with her cat. "Mom," Sarah said gently, sitting down beside her, "do you remember when you got lost and Molly found you?" Anne looked up, her eyes clear and focused, a rare moment of complete lucidity. "Of course I remember," she said, scratching Molly behind the ears. "Molly saved my life that day. She pulled me back from the street when I was about to walk into traffic. She's my guardian angel." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to touch Molly's fur. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you before," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought a cat couldn't really take care of you. I didn't understand how important she was." Anne smiled, her hand continuing to stroke Molly's fur. "She's not just a cat, Sarah. She's my guardian angel. She's been with me through everything. Your father's death, my diagnosis, moving here. She's never left me even when I couldn't remember who she was." As the seasons changed and the leaves turned from green to gold to brown, Molly became a fixture at Maplewood. The staff grew to love her, leaving treats by the door and making sure she had a warm spot to sleep when it rained. Residents would point her out to their families, telling the story of the little calico cat who visited her owner every day, no matter the weather. One cold winter day, when the ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow, Molly didn't show up. Anne sat by the window all day, her eyes fixed on the path where Molly usually appeared, her hands twisting the blanket in her lap with worry. When evening came and Molly still hadn't arrived, Anne refused to eat dinner, her eyes filled with tears. Maria sat with her, trying to reassure her. "She'll be here tomorrow, Mrs. Calloway. Maybe the snow kept her home." But Anne shook her head, her voice firm despite her confusion. "Molly would come. She always comes." The next morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Molly appeared at the door, her fur covered in melting snow, her paws leaving tiny wet prints on the floor. Anne wept when she saw her, pulling the small cat into her arms and holding her tightly. "Where were you, my sweet girl?" Anne whispered, her voice filled with relief. "I was so worried." Molly purred loudly, rubbing her head against Anne's cheek as if to say, "I'm here. I'm always here." When Anne passed away 2 years later, Molly sat by her bedside, purring softly until the very end. The staff had tried to remove her several times, concerned about hospital protocols, but Anne had held on to Molly with surprising strength, her voice firm despite her weakness. "Let her stay," Anne had whispered. "She needs to be here." And so Molly stayed, her small body pressed against Anne's chest, her purrs a steady rhythm that seemed to calm her human in her final moments. When Anne took her last breath, Molly didn't move. She simply curled up beside her, resting her head on Anne's still chest, as if waiting for her to wake up. After the funeral, Sarah came to take Molly home. She had rented a small house with a yard, specifically looking for a place that would welcome a pet. She brought a carrier with her, but Molly walked into it willingly, her green eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You don't have to do this," Maria told her as they stood outside Maplewood, the autumn leaves swirling around them. "We'd be happy to keep Molly here. She's part of the family now." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. No, Molly belongs with me. She took care of my mother when I couldn't. Now it's my turn to take care of her. At home, Sarah set up a special spot for Molly by the window, where she could watch the birds. She bought the softest blankets and the best food, but most importantly, she gave Molly time. Time to grieve, time to adjust, time to heal. Every evening, Sarah sat with Molly on her lap and told her stories about Anne, about the life they had shared before the diagnosis, about the woman who had loved Molly from the moment she found her behind that dumpster. One night, as Sarah stroked Molly's fur, tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "Thank you for taking care of her. Thank you for being there when I couldn't be." Molly purred and rubbed her head against Sarah's chin, her green eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years, as if to say, "That's what love is. That's what family is." And in that moment, Sarah finally understood what her mother had known all along. Sometimes the ones who can't speak are the ones who have the most to say. Sometimes the most profound connections are made in silence, through simple acts of presence and devotion. Molly lived for 3 more years with Sarah, growing older and slower, but never losing her gentle spirit. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep, Sarah wrapped her in Anne's favorite scarf, the same one that had saved Molly all those years ago, and buried her beneath the oak tree in the backyard. As Sarah stood by the small grave, tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what really matters." The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint sound of a purr, and for a moment Sarah felt both of them there with her, Anne and Molly together at last, their silent guardian finally at rest.